This is Lane DeFries on Thursday, June 30th, 2022 at like 1:15 p.m. in the afternoon and 3:15 p.m. your time. I'm in Denver, Colorado. And we thank you, Joan, for adding to the oral history collection of the Washakie Museum and Cultural Center in Worland, Wyoming. We have two goals. First, that our class of 1960 tells what life was like for kids and teenagers in Worland from about 1941 to 1960. The second goal is that we share how growing up in Worland impacted our adult lives. So to begin, we have some questions of introduction where you can introduce yourself. And we want to know, what is your full name, including your maiden name?
Okay, my name is Joan Walseth Purcell, and I am in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania.
And was there another name that you were, or a nickname that you were known by in your Worland days?
None that I was aware of.
Okay. If you were born in Worland, how old were you when your family arrived and when you left?
Okay, well, I was not born in Worland. I was actually born in Georgia. And when my father came home from overseas, he went back to work for Mobil Oil, where he had worked before he was called to active duty, and we were moved to Casper. So I spent like a year or two, I think kindergarten and first grade in Casper, and then my father was transferred to Worland. So that's why we ended up in Worland, and I started in Worland in second grade.
All right. So we were glad you came. And the second part of this introduction is your memories of Worland. Was your home in town? Did you live outside of the city limits?
We lived a couple of places. When we first came up to, I think my father came to Worland before my mother and my brother and I did. But one summer we came up to visit him, and that summer we lived in a trailer in a Mobil Oil camp just outside Worland. I don't remember where it was. It wasn't a very fancy trailer. It didn't have a bathroom. It had a kitchen, and there was a bathhouse down the way where you had to, for you to use the bathroom or shower that you went. And so we lived there for the summer. And then I believe we went back to Casper for a while, and then moved into town in actually a company house, a Mobil house on North 8th Street. And it was a couple blocks from downtown, and the house is still there, but the neighborhood around it is sort of industrial with sort of warehouse looking buildings. And I couldn't believe how tiny the house was. I knew it was small, but it was really tiny. If you go by it today, it had like a living room, a kitchen with room for a table, and two bedrooms, one larger bedroom and one smaller bedroom. And initially, my mother and father and my brother in a crib were in the larger bedroom, and I was in the smaller bedroom. And then at one point they switched us, and they sort of divided the room into two, and my brother was on one side and I was on the other. And then at some point my parents, I think when we moved there wasn't a lot of housing available because a lot of people were moving to Worland. And then I think in about the next, maybe 4 years later, they built a house, but they were reluctant to do that right away because they weren't sure how long we were going to be there. And it turns out we were there I was there from second grade through high school. And my parents then moved a year or two after that. But where we moved was over in a new area called Circle Road. And so they built a house, and it's still there. I drove by it recently. And it happened to be that Jimmy Hagan lived nearby, and and Judy Slothauer lived nearby. And eventually Sonia Song and her family moved there. And they had lived about a block away when I lived in the first house on North 8th Street. So that's where we lived until we moved.
And in all those years of your childhood and teenage years, as you think back on them and close your eyes, what do you remember about the sights, the sounds, or even the smells of this community?
Well, I remember watching the sugar beet trucks drive down the street that was sort of by the railroad tracks, which was about a block away, and racing down and grabbing a sugar beet off the road that had to be delicious, right? Coming home, scrubbing it in the hose, chopping it up, and tasting it and thinking, this doesn't taste anything like sugar. Being rather impressed. I also remember being able to walk to the movie theater, and there were matinees on probably Saturday afternoon. And if you had a quarter, you get like 20 cents for the movie and 5 cents for a treat. And I think that popcorn and candy cost a nickel. I also remember, that we had quite a nice little shopping area there. A number of stores that had most anything that you needed. I remember my family going to Casper or Billings sometimes when you needed like winter coats or if you were going to buy furniture, but pretty much we had what we needed there. I remember going to the drugstores and you could have those sour fizzy things. What were they called?
Phosphates?
Phosphates, right. Had lemon, cherry, lime, and those vile colors. But we seemed to all like them. And there was the 5 and dime store where if you had a few, a little bit of money, you could buy junk that you just thought was fabulous. Toys, jack balls. And I remember that everybody in the store sort of knew you. So I remember also going to the library, which was also walking distance from the house, and going through all the Nancy Drew books. And I can't remember several other series too. And, I'd race over and see if I could get the next one like every few days. So that was something that I often did was, read and scope out the books in the library. I can also remember the people all, you could walk most any place and you knew somebody who lived on that block. So, there was always someone to say hello to, and people were outside more. Kids were outside. So I'd say that we were also at that point walking distance from the Slurp and Burp, if you can imagine. And I can remember walking over there with a friend to get like a hot dog and a Coke for about a quarter. And we also used to go to Wilson's drive-in.
Yes.
And, with friends, sometimes we would meet. I remember walking every place in town and riding my bike, even out to some of the farms. I remember riding my bike out to Janice Voss's with, friends, and then riding back in. I also remember the smell of silage. Remember if you had friends that were on a farm and they had this silage pit, which I guess was beet pulp and corn stalks and things. They fed the animals, and that had a sort of sour smell.
The farmer's compost.
I also remember driving the other way in town and seeing those beautiful purple flares flaring off poison gas and those huge yellow loaves of sulfur that I guess they would chop up and put in boxcars or open cars and send someplace. But I remember the smell of that. I also remember going with my father out to the oil fields, and there was always what they called a swabbing pit, which had stuff squirting out of it, and sometimes it would catch fire and burn, and it had a beautiful flame too. So all these things probably were bad for the environment, although I remember my father sort of groaning, because even in that day, in the late 40s and 50s, the environmental agency would come and inspect the sites. And if they took a well down, they would have to put everything back the way it was, including, take out the roads and plant some of the native plants back in the roadways. And yet I guess they didn't care much about the poisonous gas flaring off. Although I don't remember anybody really being very sick because of it. So maybe we were adapted to it. I'm not sure.
And I remember you talking about skiing.
Oh, that's right. Well, I think that when we were talking about what did we do for fun when we weren't going to school, on weekends, and I would go skiing, and but my mother played the organ for church, so we weren't allowed to go skiing until after church. So we would pile in the car, change our clothes on the way, get up to Meadowlark, because we had missed that ride over. I don't know if you remember that, but there used to be a tractor with a hood of a car upside down on the snow with ropes extending from that. And if you got there early, you could get a ride, because you had to park and climb down the frozen side of the road, which was, you had to climb up about 3 feet and then down maybe 6 feet, and then kind of get to the lake, and then kind of go across the lake. I think it was about 3/4 of a mile to get to the rope tow. And they had no ski patrol, no ski school, none of that. Whoever got there first would start I think it was a tractor engine that pulled the rope tow up. So my dad used to take my brother and I think sometimes a friend, and then he decided that if he had to go, he might as well ski too. So he had skied as a child in South Dakota, and he's from a Norwegian family. So I assume that their ancestors probably cross-countryed sometimes to get places there. So he started skiing when he was like 50 years old at Meadowlark, and skied until he was 84.
Oh, that's remarkable.
Yeah. And so I remember doing that. I also remember going for picnics up in Ten Sleep Canyon with my family. And I sometimes didn't want to go because I want to stay and play with my friends, but we would go and, cook hot dogs or hamburgers and just go up for the day, and usually fall in the stream, get wet. So that was something that I remember doing. And other things I remember doing in the summer, were just laying on the grass and looking at the sky and figuring out what the clouds looked like, if they were elephants or giraffes or Mickey Mouses or, all those things. And also, we lived on a street that had gravel. So we would grab the rocks, get a hammer or a couple of rocks, try and crack them open to find ribbon agates. And sometimes it took a long time. I had a rock collection. So, this was pretty typical neighborhood activity. And the other thing, since we were pretty near the railroad tracks, although our parents, we'd take the rocks and put them on the railroad tracks and then stand back and wait for a train to come and see if that would crack it open. And also put pennies on the track and get them, squashed out. I say, I don't think our parents knew about that.
Probably not.
So also swimming. I remember when we got the swimming pool and spending many afternoons going to the pool, meeting friends there, spending the afternoon swimming when I was, like in probably middle school before we were old enough to work. Did a lot of babysitting too, but I didn't ever take children I was taking care of to the pool. So that's
Well, thank you for sharing those rich memories. And before we started this recording, You've chosen some topics that you'd like to share, and we'll go chronologically to make it easier for listeners to follow, and then take a look back from your adult perspective. And one of the questions is, what do you remember about your childhood prior to starting first grade? This would have been from about 1941 to September of 1948. And you mentioned that you have some World War II memories regarding your dad and your family.
Right. Well, my grandmother had come to live with us when I was born, and then my father was shipped overseas, and my grandmother died. So it was a sort of a scary story for my mother, because it was very hard to get doctors during wartime. So she finally found someone to come and see her mother, and she said, well, he said she had to go to the hospital. And so my mother was standing there with her mother going out the door and holding me, and I was 2 years old, and kind of not deciding which way to go. And so the doctor told her that her mother would be fine, so she should stay with me. And she was living in a new town then, so she didn't know anybody. And lo and behold, my grandmother died. So my mother had to go home to South Dakota she's the youngest child, and sort of take care of her house and make sure it was sold and her belongings were distributed or sold. And we were living with my other grandmother, and she thought we should stay with her during the rest of the war, because I was the eldest grandchild, the only grandchild, I think, at that time. But my mother really wanted to be on her own. And when they were first married, they had lived in Southern California, and she had a brother in Southern California, in Santa Barbara. So we then went on the train, and I vaguely remember this. And I remember I got sick on the train, and I was throwing up all over the place. And at one point, my mother got off to try and find a doctor, and she had a little room on the train, and she got back on, and they had given it away because she couldn't find a doctor. So finally, some military doctor came and took a look at me and said, well, when you get to where you're going, you should definitely take her straight to the hospital. And so that I remember, because I remember being just little and having IVs in my legs, and my mother sleeping on the foot of the bed because she didn't have any place to live yet. And finally, we found a place to live, and I remember being there and walking through the walnut orchards to go to town. And then I remember my father came home from overseas. It was a rainy day, and we were driving, and the water was squirting up like big fans beside the car. And we finally got to where he was, and we found him. And I remember, his uniform. And then for some reason, they left me in the car, and I was very unhappy about that. But my dad had wanted to go to the PX and buy me a present. So he brought back this cat that was covered in rabbit fur that I think I had until it disintegrated or was eaten by something. But I remember very well. And then when he came, when we went to where we lived, he had malaria. And I can remember my mother bringing him ice water in a coffee pot, those glass coffee pots that had a bottom and a top, and the ice would clink. Is that he was shaking so badly that the ice would clink. And I think the reason he got malaria was they told him to stop taking the quinine too soon when they came back from overseas. And he was really fortunate because he didn't ever have relapses after that. He had the one episode, and a lot of people would have relapses every few years, and he didn't. But that's how we got to Wyoming, because he had worked for Mobil Oil before. Actually, he worked for Lockheed, and they laid him off when World War II came on. So he went to work for Mobil Oil, and when he came back, he still was eligible to work there, and they transferred us to Casper. So one thing I remember is stopping somewhere in the mountains and getting out, and my father showing me snow. And it was kind of gray and gritty, but he insisted that we make some snowballs and, throw them. And then I remember going to sleep in the car and waking up in Casper, and everything was covered with this thick white frosting. It had snowed while I was asleep. And those little boxes on the telephone poles, that they were covered with about 4 inches of snow. The cars were covered, the houses were covered, the roads were covered. And I thought it was the most beautiful fairyland kind of experience that one could have. So we lived in Casper for a couple of years, and then my dad was transferred to Worland. So that's how we got to Worland in the second grade.
And what do you remember about your elementary school? That would be approximately 1948 to 1954.
Well, I know that I was like a block from either I don't remember which buildings, which were the Watson and the Emmett building. And I had a terrifying teacher who happened to live across the street from me. So I was pretty much scared during my elementary years. She kind of, frightened me. And later my mother said, yeah, I was a little worried about that, but I don't think that parents ever said anything to teachers about the horrible things that were happening in that classroom. But I can remember Mrs. Beard reading us books every afternoon after lunch. I think it was Mrs. Baird, and really enjoying the stories. And sometimes we'd beg her to read a second chapter, and she would. And I remember reciting poems, The Village Smithy, and a few others, because that was something that we all had to memorize the poems and then recite them to the class. And I believe that's when we started in band, because I remember having to walk from there to the middle school or the junior high for band lessons, and then we would walk back, which seems sort of surprising, but I think we all did it. And I started on a saxophone because my father had a saxophone. He'd played the saxophone, and I hated it. It just had too many fingers. So then I switched to a French horn, which I played in the band eventually. But that's what I remember about elementary school. One, being really frightened for a long time, and then having some very kind teachers who were very encouraging and positive. So,
yeah, the balance there.
Right.
And how did you feel your time after school, on weekends, or during the summers when you were in elementary?
I think that's when we would lay on the back and look at clouds, smash rocks, and look for agates, and go on picnics in the mountains. So I think we pretty much talked about that.
Yeah.
And swim.
Yeah. And then came our junior high years, and it was junior high at that time for 7th and 8th years.
6th, 7th, and 8th, right? I went there in 6th grade.
Oh, did you?
We started in more like a middle school, because I think that last grade in the Watson building or the Emmett building, whichever it was 5th grade. So I don't know if that was different for you on the other side of town.
It could have been, yeah, because some of us were in elementary on the 6th grade.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that I was in 6th grade in the elementary year, because that's when I was. But we had to change classes in 6th grade, and I remember losing a pencil every time I changed classes. I couldn't quite get it together to get everything. I mean, now kids have these little backpacks that they use, but we just sort of carried things in our arms and went from class. I think we had lockers, but I don't remember so much. I remember changing classes, and I remember the band, which was a big deal in middle school. And when you first got your uniform so you could march in one of the parades. And of course, Mr. Broadbent was very much of a showman, and he had us doing all kinds of fun things. And I mean, the band trips were a big deal in the summer. And we would go to all these parades, get up early in the morning, and then, play and have fun, and then ride back on the bus. And we would go, I mean, quite a ways away. I think we would go to Casper sometimes, and Douglas, and closer places. But I remember that being a lot of fun.
And we thought every school district did that.
We did. We did. I remember those green uniforms. I thought the first time I got to wear a uniform, I thought it was really exciting.
And it was. So then you moved on to senior high school, and that would have been approximately September 1956 to our graduation in 1960.
I think I remember some of the teachers were characters. I remember Mrs. Cook, who used to have Kleenexes down her neck, and she used to look for it. She said, "Oh, I know there's one down here someplace." As she'd kind of look at her neck, down her neck. And I remember the Shakespeare plays that we studied. Remember Romeo and Juliet, a teacher in freshman year, and she eventually married Jack Slaughtower. I can't think of her name, what her name was. And I remember Mrs. White, I think junior English. I remember Mr. Schwartz, who would go screaming to the back of the class, screaming, "Help, help, somebody's letting poisonous gas out." And I remember making borax beads, and sometimes we trick us and give us plain water, and we couldn't figure out what it was. Remember Asa Brooks teaching biology, and some of the boys would ask him questions that he really didn't want to answer, and he would turn bright red. And I remember the dances after all of the events. I think I would bring a record player, and people would bring records. And I mean, there were no refreshments. There was no big deal. You just went after every wrestling match, basketball game, whatever it was, and into the gym undecorated. And it was very simple, but we all went and we had a good time. I also remember the support from the community. I think it was unique that everybody in town went to all of the basketball games. I don't remember if they went to the wrestling matches, but they certainly went to the football games. I mean, that little gym was full, and the football stands were full too. So that was a big part of the community, I think, supporting the high school and the high school teams.
Right.
I remember also decorating for the proms, and you mentioned earlier the floats. I hadn't remembered the floats, but I do remember getting passes to get out of class and go decorate for in fact, in my other room, I have some flowers that we made for one of our junior senior proms, crepe paper flowers that had two colors of crepe paper put together and sort of wound together with some florist tape. And I thought I should really throw these away. So I think I will.
We took such pride, didn't we?
I'm a little bit of a pack rat in some ways, so I've got to get rid of some of this stuff or my kids will never forgive me.
And you also mentioned about television. You were in high school, you said, when you got your first TV. And what was your experience like?
My first what?
Experience with the television.
Oh, that's right. Well, I know that people had it, and they had big towers before. And my father said none of his kids were going to sit around and watch that boob tube. They were going to do other things. So we didn't have it, but other people did, and they would call me to babysit. And if I was kind of hemming and hawing, they say, "Oh, but we have television." So I thought, okay. And I think today you would throw that set away if you saw what we saw, because it was all snowy, and sometimes it was only a shadow of a person maybe across it, and you could hear the voices, but you really couldn't see anything. So television wasn't a very big deal. And I think we did get it when I was 16, but my brother liked it, but we didn't have much. I think it came on maybe around noon and signed off around 10 o'clock. And I remember him watching Red Skelton or My Little Margie, kind of a lady in the office. But I think when you don't have television until you're 16, you're busy with other things, and it's not terribly interesting. But it's, I think I mentioned earlier that my husband worked for Comcast, which is based in Philadelphia, and he didn't work for the cable part, he worked for another division. But when I was saying to somebody who worked for them that we didn't really have television until they could have cable, and I told him the area where I lived, and he said, "Oh yeah, we know about that," because basically Comcast is cable television. So they were aware of these communities that couldn't get a signal in over the mountains. So, I mean, I still wasn't really a television viewer until the pandemic. Since the pandemic, I have seen quite a few series from the top to the bottom. But I'm
Well,
over.
here we are, class of 1960, turning 80. And because of the COVID pandemic, we've had to postpone 2 60th reunions. Finally, we got together in person.
Right.
But over those 2 years that we delayed, we talked a lot about our times together, thanks to emails, Zoom, and telephones. May I say, phones without operators, like when we were kids.
Right.
This is our chance to look back and consider, what about the experience of growing up in Worland created the most impact on your life?
For me, I think it was the extreme freedom we had in our community. I mean, being able to go anywhere, most any time. If you did something wrong, your mother probably heard about it before you got home, and it gave me a real sense of security. And I think that it made me also a little naive, which I don't think is necessarily a bad thing, because I've, I mean, in the work that I've done here in Philadelphia, primarily, I worked in a lot of underprivileged, underserved areas, and it never occurred to me to be afraid. I mean, I used to go into some of the high-rise projects at 5 o'clock at night to see kids, and it really it didn't worry me. So I think it maybe gave me a sense of invincibility, like I was safe wherever I went, and maybe that aura kept me safe. I don't know, but I think when I see in my neighborhood, children are walked to the bus stop and met at the bus stop, and I think that's a little sad because we had that freedom to go most any place, and you knew somebody knew you most wherever you went. So I think it also was a community that where we had many different kinds of people, with especially at the time I was there. I remember having wonderful fun going out with a geologist to look for dinosaur gizzard bones, and just doing things like that were sort of unique to the area. And I think that my parents had friends from different places that had different experiences. So I think and I also like that. I mean, I really wasn't aware of what anybody's father did necessarily. I had a feeling that we were all pretty equal in many ways, and it was sort of inclusive in that way. I mean, I think there are some groups in our community that were excluded in some ways, but for the most part, at least in high school, I think everybody sort of mixed with everybody else. I mean, you seemed like you sort of mixed more with people that lived in your neighborhood and were close. But I think that um, I was really not aware of a lot of social or economic differences in our community. And I'm sure there were, but to me, it didn't feel like that. And I think that was nice.
And another question that you chose is uh, like if you're chatting with your most trusted friends, do you say you had a happy time or not so happy time as a young person in Worland? And so many of the experiences you've just described would lead to.
Well, I really I was very happy there. I'll tell you, I cried all the way to Oklahoma because my family moved from Worland to Oklahoma. And then shortly after that, from Oklahoma to Kansas before they moved back to Casper. So I had a sort of a sense of not really belonging anywhere much because when you move post high school, you really don't make friends. And you're in college, you don't really make friends with people your age. So, and since my family didn't live in Worland, I didn't really have any reason to go back there necessarily. And my family lived a distance away. So I guess I feel badly that I didn't work harder to stay connected. And I really enjoyed reconnecting through this 2-year reunion process with the people and the memories that we had growing up. But I thought it was a lovely place to grow up.
And Joan, is there anything else you'd like to talk about?
I don't think so.
You covered a lot of information that's been so interesting to listen to. And in closing, for generations to come that may listen to your story years from now, is there any wisdom you'd like to pass on to them? What would you want them to know?
I think it's very important to try and stay connected to the people you grew up with. And for a number of reasons, I didn't do that as well as I should have. And I think that you share the things you share in childhood and even through high school are very special experiences that you can't have with anybody else. So I would say try and stay connected to the people throughout your life.
Thank you.